Hey, and welcome back to Gaming for Tokens. I'm Marshall, and in this episode we're going to be talking about the functionality of the GUI, the different UI assets and things like that that we can hook up together or hook up into code and kind of get them playing nice with each other and kind of starting to build a UI that is functional. A couple things that I wanted to start with. Sorry if you hear any noise. There's still construction going on right next door, so I can imagine that you hear a little beep, beep, beep in the background. Sorry, there's nothing I can really do about that. Next thing I wanted to touch on was I promised you in the last video that I would look up what the hell drag threshold and force module active were on the event system. I've done that, and they are as convoluted as I thought they would be. Well, the drag threshold isn't that bad. So they both kind of pertain to having multiple types of input on your UI. The drag threshold specifically is used for things like touch devices, so tablets, phones, that sort of thing. The drag threshold is if you have this too low, it will it'll make it so that when you touch a button on a touch device, when you tap a button, it won't register it as a tap because it does not register. It's like what's the difference between a tap and a swipe? This determines what that is. So if you have this set really, really high, then a swipe could be registered as a tap. So effectively, I think this is the number of pixels of movement you can have in a gesture, quote unquote. So in like a tap or in a swipe, the amount of movement you can have in that motion for it to register as a tap and not a swipe. The reason why you need something like this is because touch devices aren't, well, we as human beings are not very accurate with the way that our hands work, right? So like if we tap something, it feels like we didn't move, but we probably did a little bit, you know? It's not a precise thing, and touch devices have never been a precise method of input, just because they are so, like, the detection is kind of wishy-washy, and it's all based off of direct human input. So because of that, it's never going to be 100% accurate. So this is a way of kind of finagling in that like low end of movement to get it so that you can actually have taps instead of swipes for everything. So yeah, that's what the drag threshold does. So if you're not using touch devices, you don't even need to worry about it, which is awesome. The other thing was force module active, which this guy is a lot more convoluted, and it sounds like doesn't even work correctly in Unity. I looked around on a couple forums and things to try to figure out what the hell this thing does, because the documentation was very, very slim. There was not much on it. Basically what it... force module active, if you look it up in the Unity like API and the manual and stuff, it basically just says it forces the input module active. And you're like, great, cool. That's really useful. It specifically says that it will force the input module that is currently being used that meets a certain, again, quote-unquote, set of parameters, set of usability parameters or whatever. It'll set that one to being active, which it doesn't go into detail what those parameters are. It doesn't go into it doesn't say anything about how this thing is used. Looking it up on the forums, this is basically what I gathered from it. Those parameters are the type of device you have and the type of input you're expecting to get. So if you were to build this out to be like, this would work for a PC build, right? Or like a controller, some sort of a controller input system as well. But if you, I'm going to copy the component and I'm going to paste it as new. So if you wanted this to be like a mobile thing, you could say, instead of horizontal, you could say swipe LR if that's your input for swiping left and right. And then you could do swipe up, down, and then you could do tap as your submit button, and then you could say, I don't know what the hell the cancel button would be, probably nothing. So then you could set this up as your touch input module, and then if you built a thing to iPad or to like a phone or to whatever, then this would this would be the one that would be active by default. But if you wanted it to always be active, then you can say force this one to be active. So again, kind of convoluted, and you don't need to worry about that checkbox at all if you're not doing multiple input modules and multiple ways of interacting with your UI. I don't know why you'd even want a standard input module for anything but this. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. It feels like you wouldn't, because again, these components are used to navigate between buttons without clicking or tapping on them. So in other words, like I pull my left joystick down and it selects the next button, right? That's what this thing is used for, as far as I understand it. So I don't understand why you would need that for a touch device when you can just tap on the thing. Yeah, that's my opinion on that. But maybe there's a reason. There's probably a reason. I mean, hell, they built the functionality in so that you could do it, so there's probably a reason to do it. But yeah, you probably don't need to ever worry about those. So that's a good thing that I didn't really know what they did, and this is a good reason why I didn't know what they did. So anyway, going into the meat of the video, now that we're 6 minutes in, and yeah. What I have built here is a very, very simple UI. Same deal, it's just, it was a blank Unity scene, and I messed with the camera. I think it's actually the exact same scene that I was using in the last video. I just deleted everything and started anew. So, yeah, we have our in-game UI asset, which is our canvas. We have our UI cam, everything is parented to it, so our event system and all that stuff is in here too. I might as well drag my UI master object, which we'll get into what that is in a minute. And yeah, I have the camera set to 2D and all that. I've created all these buttons. There's also a couple disabled objects in here that you'll see what they are in a minute. But I have my buttons 1, 2, 3, my drop down, and this is all sorted in alphabetical order, not order on the screen. Sorry about that. So button 1, 2, 3, I have my input field here. I have a drop down menu. I have a slider. I have a toggle, and I have a test button. Functionality wise, everything works. You can go in here and you can click on things and stuff happens, and you can type stuff. You can select different things on the drop down. You can drag sliders, toggle buttons, hit buttons. So what exactly does all this do? You probably saw, if you were paying attention, a bunch of debug stuff appear at the bottom. Well, if you could. I'm also going to close this guy. This guy shouldn't be here. Sorry about that. Cool. All right. So yeah, you may have noticed down here that there was some debug stuff appearing. I have some debug logs attached to some of the buttons so we can see how they're functioning. But everything runs through my UI master script that I have. So this is just a script that I've basically used as a variable storage. It's the buttons and the UI and stuff hook into this thing, and then they set variables on this thing. They also call some function on it, and we'll get there by the end of the video for sure. So if I open the script up, this is what it looks like, and I already blew it all up for you guys. So this is the GUI tests master. It's a couple variables on it. There's a toggle variable, a float variable, a couple strings, and a list of submenu objects, which are up here. They're a class that I wrote. That'll be the last thing that I touch on. It's kind of the more interesting one. And then I have a private variable for current submenu, which is part of that submenu stuff. So on start, I'm hiding all my submenus. Again, talk about that towards the end. But what I do have is these couple toggle functions here. I have two different kinds. I have one that'll just toggle my toggle boolean, and that'll set it to the opposite of whatever it was. And then I have a SetToggle, which takes in a toggle. So this is one of the more simple things in the UI. Not the simplest, but one of the more simple ones. So on your UI objects over here, you have so on the toggle, for example, you have a toggle script that is built onto the thing. You have a bunch of different things on here, but at the bottom you have the messenger, I guess is what I want to call it. The event for on value changed. So this is an event that gets fired every time the value on this little guy down here, this little toggle down here, changes. So if it goes from true to false, false to true, it'll send this event. On these objects, and these are going to be on every one of the UI objects. Some of them have two, like the input field. The slider only has one. The drop down has two. No, it has one. Sorry. And then the buttons all have one. On the toggle, it... Well, on every object, you can create a list of these events for it to these messages for it to send. You can tell it to only run during runtime or on editor and runtime. You can set the in-game UI to be usable when you're not in play mode. I typically don't do that just because I want to see how it looks to the end user. I don't want to see some half-built, like, not in-game version of what I'm doing, because that seems weird to me. Plus, you can get your UI into strange states where it's all out of order, and then it's just out of order that way if you hit save. So I prefer to only do runtime. Plus, that's the default. You can get yourself into some sticky situations if you do editor and runtime. You can also just tell it to be off, so I can tell this to not fire. I could be wrong, but I believe you can also set these during runtime, which would be awesome. So if you have like a say you have a toggle like this, you check the toggle, but then that toggle then can set the events that are fired on a button in your UI. So you can have it so the UI can kind of change dynamically depending on other aspects of the UI. That would require some scripting stuff, obviously. That wouldn't be a native thing, but you'll kind of see how that stuff works a little bit towards the end. Anyway, again, so you can create multiples of these. The way that these work are they have an object in them. So you have my UI master, for example, and then you have a drop down here of the different things that you can do on this object. So you have the game object, which is what it is. You have the transform, which is, again, kind of sort of what it is. So again, you have the game object, which is this thing. You have the transform, and then you have the script that is attached to it. So that's what you get here for options. You can the game object, the transform, or the script that I have attached to it. And these are all the different functions and things like that that are associated with those components. So if you wanted to, you can send message to the game object, and then you can call a function on the game object. That would actually send message to the entire thing. So it would send message to every single script on that object. You can also set active if you want, and then you can set the object to true or false. So if the value changed, here I'll actually I'll turn this guy off and I'll show you what that does. So again, what I did is I told, well, yeah, okay, sure. So when we go in here and we toggle this toggle, so when we change this, it's going to turn this object off. So if you watch this little check mark up here, if I turn this on, oh, it didn't work. Did I do that wrong? Oh, that's why, because I had it checked. Okay, so now if I do that again, you'll see that this guy, when I change the value of it, will actually turn this object off entirely. Now here's the thing, it won't turn it back on ever, because this isn't a set it to the value of the toggle. This is a turn it off. If this value is ever changed, turn it off. So regardless of what it's changed to, it will turn it off. So you have to be kind of careful when you do things like that. There isn't a way, as far as I know, to natively say, hey, set me to the value of the bool. I know it says here on value change boolean. So in theory, the event is gathering the new value of the toggle. I just don't know how to make it send to the event. I've tried a bunch of different ways to do it. I just don't think it's possible. I kind of have a workaround though, and I will talk about that next. Basically, in the script that I wrote that is attached to that object, you will see a few things here, like SetToggle, right? Or there is just the toggle function. So what that's going to do is it's going to reach into our script here, and it's going to call this function. If I grab the UI master, you can see that toggle boolean, which is a public variable right here. You can see it visible at the top of the object there. So if I hit play and I toggle this, it changes. And if I untoggle it, it changes back. Because every time I change the value on this, it changes the boolean state of this guy. Now here's the thing, if I toggle this by default, and then I come into here, my UI toggle is set to false, but my tracked toggle is set to true. And if I check it, then they're always going to be the inverse of one another. If that's what you want, then awesome. This is an easy way to do that. again, all I did was I dragged the UI master object into here and said, hey, call my toggle function when you change value. The thing is you're not, because they're so separated from each other's values, like one is setting the other one, but it's not, no, it doesn't know what it's setting it to, and the toggle in the UI master doesn't know what the toggle in the UI is set to. There's no like communication back and forth there. They are disconnected from each other. They will not, doing it that way will not guarantee that the toggles are ever the same value, or ever the opposite value for that matter. It'll just guarantee that the value on the UI master will change when you toggle the UI toggle. That's a problem, probably. The way around that is what I've done here. I have a new what is it? I have a new function called SetToggle that takes in a toggle. So a toggle is this script here, right? So I'm taking in that object, and I'm gathering the value of the actual UI toggle, and I'm setting the GUI master toggle to that value. I realize now the error of my ways with calling them both toggle. Sorry about that. So what this does instead is it will, so if I go to my UI master here, and remember this is set to true and this is set to false by default, if I hit this to be true, this doesn't change because it's setting it to true when I change the value, and then when I uncheck it, it'll set it to false, which you see that changed up there, and that keeps happening. Now that they're guaranteed to be in sync if I've changed this. If you're following along with me, you may have had some hard time actually, getting your mono-develop or whatever you're using to autocomplete this toggle object. I should have mentioned before that you're going to need to, at the top, type using Unity Engine.ui. It is not automatically imported when you import Unity Engine for some reason. So you need to actually type that line. That'll allow you to access all of these different UI objects in your script. So that's an easy way to show how a toggle functions in the UI in code. So a practical use for this could be what I use it for most of the time is a full screen toggle, right? So in the options menu, you have a checkbox for, do you want this to be full screen or not? Then you set your resolution. That would usually be a drop-down menu of sorts. And then you then hit an apply button, right? So this toggle value could very easily not be a toggle value. It could be a full screen value. And now whenever you check this box, it'll set, do you want full screen or not? And then when you hit the button, which we're about to talk about next, it will apply the stored changes in your script, right? So you're going to store, do you want this to be full screen? And then you're going to have like a resolution, a value, and then you're going to have a button that then hooks in and says, hey, set these values to be whatever we want them to be. Eventually, I can actually make a settings menu and go over my process for that if you guys want. Making setting menus is something that I kind of have down to a science at this point. It's very easy for me. I've done it so many times now that it's second nature almost. Anyway, so that's a toggle. Moving on to the buttons, we have our test button here. Our test button does something very, very similar to the toggle. You're going to see a lot of repeated stuff here. I'm just going to kind of go over some subtle changes that I'm doing to things when that stuff hits. So in the test button, again, we're calling the UI master, and we're hitting a button hit script. So what's going to happen here is when we hit our test button, it's going to come up with button test button pressed. So it sounds redundant, but it's because it's going to... this test button the button hit function calls for a button script, and when I drag that in here, it's going to pull the name of the game object that is associated with that script as the button that I hit. So if I wanted to, I could just name this button 99, and then when I hit that, it's actually going to say button 99 pressed. So the actual text on the button is completely separated from the button that is actually hit. This is not a great way to go about things, in my opinion. The reason why I now have to, if I do it this way, then I have to drive my code off of what the objects are called in the engine, which is not a good way to do things, because if you're working on a team with people, oh man, there's a lot of noise going on outside. If you are working on a team with a bunch of people, and then you expect people to come in and, like, say you are working with a UI, UX artist or whatever, and they come in and they do a bunch of art to your UI assets, they may end up changing the name of one of the objects, and that can break your code, which is not the ideal way to go about that. If you guys can hear that outside, I am very sorry. They are right in front of my apartment. Okay. So you can do it this way, and this function that I'm calling is this guy. Man, that is loud. So the button hit script takes in a button sender, and then all I'm doing is I'm debug logging button sender name pressed, and sender being the button. So again, I'm just pulling the name of that game object. Not the ideal way to do it. You'll see that I have a bunch of different button variables here. Actually, this is not a button variable. This is a input field, which is one of the more complicated ones. We'll get there in a second. But so I have 3 different button functions here. This one doesn't seem to do anything except for debug log that a button was pressed. This one actually says which button was pressed, and this one has a number associated with it. So these are basically the gambit of least useful to most useful as far as I'm concerned for UI stuff. Knowing that a button was pressed but not which one is pretty useless, because if you have 5 buttons on the screen and you say, hey, a button was pressed, great, who cares, because I don't know what to do with that information. If I know which button was pressed object-wise, that's more helpful, because then I can figure it out, kinda. Like, I know which button was pressed, so I can probably gather some sort of information and do something based off of that. But ideally, I have this one called, which is, hey, you hit a button and it was button number 4. And then on this object, on the GUI tests master, I can then make a list of things that are associated with numbers, and then say, great, when button 4 is pressed, open this menu. When button 3 is pressed, open this menu. Or even, hey, this is menu number 2. When button number 2 is pressed, open menu number 2. Right? You can do very, very kind of. It's simple, but it's advanced. It's kind of streamlined things with just inserting numbers in for your buttons. And that's what I've done for all of these. Buttons 1, 2, and 3 will, there we go. They all have the same function called, which is actually, that's another thing that I wanted to touch on. I forgot. All of these are called the exact same thing, but they take in different variables, right? So that makes each one of these like an optional thing. So if I, for example, said button hit, I now have these left-right arrows here, and I can go 1, 2, 3, and I can go between the 3 different types. So I can insert nothing, I can insert a number, and I can insert, or an integer rather, and I can insert a button object. What that translates to out here is that when you grab the GUI master script, you have 3 of the same thing, and you have to specify which one you want to use, because that'll give you the proper field below it associated with that object that it's expecting to gather. So in this case, I'm using button hit integer, and I am assigning 1, 2, and 3 respectively to my buttons, and that is going to print out this script. So you see button, what number it is, and then pressed. And I will show you what that looks like. By the way, if you ever see your UI do that thing that just happened there, where all the text is gone, it's fine. Unity freaks out sometimes as soon as you hit play or like load the scene again or whatever. It'll fix itself. It's just a bug in the display for the UI. All right. So again, before we did this. It says button test button pressed, and this one is going to say button 1 pressed, button 2 pressed, button 3 pressed. So again, the benefit of that is that I can now hook that number up directly to something else, and I know exactly what button is pressed. And side benefit, I can actually create multiple buttons that attach to the same number, and I can associate things with that number. So say you can have like an up and a down button, and you can increment something based off of values, right? So if I really wanted to, I could actually say this is -1, and now I can increment something +1 or -1. You can do some pretty cool stuff with just putting a number associated with a button, and I typically find this the way to go. But I think I've hammered on that enough. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the slider, because the slider again is pretty easy. Looking at our UI master object again, we have this float val object, or this float val variable, and if I drag my slider, you'll see that that actually changes. Schmancy, right? It goes from 0 to 1, and you can actually change that based on the slider here. You can say there's a min value, max value, make this -1, and now when I grab the UI master and hit play, so this guy goes to -1 to +1. So again, this is an easy way to do stuff like, I don't know, brightness, or like some games do a difficulty slider. It's just a float value that's assigned to everything that's a multiplier, effectively, on like enemy health or whatever. So yeah, you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. You can also change it from left to right to left to top to bottom, or whatever you want. Kind of went over that in the last video, but none of that actually will change the information output from it, right? And the way that I'm doing that, again, it's just an on value changed. So the on value changed is, again, as soon as it is changed, and it'll make more sense on why I'm hammering on that when we get to the input field. But if I click down and I drag, it is updating that float value, and then I unclick and then it stops updating it, right? The input field does some different stuff. But that's how this one functions, and it's so every frame that this is in a different position on the slider, it sends that value to GUI test master. So that's firing a lot of times, just for context. So you typically don't want to associate a really big function with that, like a really, really expensive set of code. Like if you have, say, a file, like a settings save system that you've scripted, you probably don't want to associate a file save or load with dragging the slider, because it's going to happen every frame, and it's going to really bog down your systems and your UI and stuff like that. So word of warning: save it as a float, and then assign a like save button to only save when you hit that button, instead of like every time you make a change. In saying that, I feel like I shouldn't have to say it, but I know that I should. I know that somebody's going out there is going to make that mistake, and it's going to suck for them, and they're not going to understand why it's that way. So yeah. Now moving on to the input field. I should probably mention the slider takes in a slider object. So going back to our script here, we have hey, this isn't input field. This is a slider. Not a silder, a slider. Hey. All right. So all this does is it takes in the slider, and then all I'm doing is saying new value dot value. So I never really talked about this, but each one of these things has a huge list of things that you can access on it. Typically, the most useful bit of information is the value of the object, because that's the current value of the thing. Which is really what you want to know, right? Everything else you set in engine, so you don't really need to access it through code, but I guess you could if you wanted to. Like, you can say that every time you change this value, the new val dot, I don't know, let's say the fade duration. Oh, I can't change the fade duration? What? Come on. Let's change the, I don't know, min value to equal whatever the negative of new val dot value is. This is gonna not be fun to see. It's gonna basically change the way that the entire slider functions. So if we have this slider and when we drag it positive, you'll see that the min value is actually changing drastically. And if we drag it negative, the value is actually it's kind of weird. Like, the value will now never be negative, which is an interesting thing. Because if you look over here at the actual value of the object, it's like, it's barely above 0, because we're changing it to the negative value of whatever the current value is. Or rather, we're changing the minimum value to whatever the value currently is, which changes what the value currently is. It's kind of circular in that way. So the min value now is negative 3.7, but the actual value is 3.7, because it'll never actually reach the... Anyway, I could go on for a little while about how messed up this is. But yeah, so you can do things like that where you can change aspects of the UI based off of things that you set in the UI. Which, foreshadowing, we're going to be doing that. Yeah. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the input field. The input field is a little more complicated because it's got 2 different types of events, and we could use either one. The input field, just as a refresher, is the thing that you click on and you type in, and you can either click off of it or you can type something and then hit enter. Either way, that's important, because when you deselect the object or when you hit enter, you are completing the text field. You are done editing it. You'll see over here that on the right there are 2 different types of events. There's onValueChanged and onEndEdit. So onValueChanged is the exact same thing that the slider has. onValueChanged. And again, remember, the slider actually has a what I was saying before. It fires every single frame that thing is changed. So if you're continually changing, if you're dragging that slider over the course of several frames, it is sending that event every single frame that you are changing it. The input field is doing the same thing. Every single frame that there is a difference in that field, it will send that event. That's this guy. Typically, there's no point for that, right? Okay, well, that's not entirely true. Oftentimes, and I'm sure that you've played a game where you've seen this before, they'll have a text field, and you'll put in a name, and then you'll hit the next button, and then it won't take the name. That's a poorly built UI, but it's also it's usually a symptom of the engine, right? The engine doesn't recognize hitting the next button as you completing that text string, because the next button event has fired before the text string end event has fired, and it creates a confusion. But that is the time that you would want to use onValueChanged, because you can round about that issue. You can say, okay, well, every time that this value is different, store that value. That way we always know what you last typed. The onEndEdit is a really, really easy way to say, well, here, I'll show you. We're gonna create a new button. We're gonna drag it down to this text field, and we're gonna negative 50, and then we're gonna change the size of the thing. We're gonna say the width is gonna be like 50. We're going to move it over here like that. It'll be negative 175. And this is going to be a done button. We're going to move it a little further. Whoa, hey. We're going to move it a little further over. Negative 190. Yeah, there we go. So this is actually going to be associated with the text field, right? So this is going to be unchecked by default, so it's not going to exist, but the input field is going to say onEndEdit done game object set active to true. So what's going to happen now is when I come over here and I type something, as soon as I hit enter, the done button appears and I can hit that button, which it's still hooked up like our button 1 because I duplicated button 1. But now this isn't a perfect way of doing things, because if I delete everything and then I click off of it, done is still there, and it shouldn't be, right? But that's kind of the idea with the input field. You wouldn't want that to happen on, like, on value changed, right? Because then it would be setting that value every single time you typed a key into this thing, or every time you hit a key while you have this thing selected, which is not the best. Yeah. So the value that I have set up here is I have the input value, and for our input field, I'm going to say on end. We're going to grab the UI master, we're going to go into here, and we're going to say set input value, and then the input field is going to go into here. So it's much like our other UI assets. The input field is very simple. We just set the input value to the text of the input field. And again, I very much... I encourage you guys to do some experimentation. That's how I found out what all this stuff was, right? I just created an input field, dragged it in here, and then I hit dot, and then come on, dot, and then I searched through the different things that were in here. I found text. Text is what I wanted off of that. Again, it's kind of like value, but this doesn't actually have a value, like a value variable. And looking over here on the right, illuminated that there is a text value, and then when you use the input field, that text value changes. So again, if I hit enter, my UI master now has that exact same string in here. So yeah, my point is I'm just encouraging you guys to like look at the objects, like look at the input field and figure out what components you want to access, and then access those in all the noise outside. Holy hell, come on. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of how I've been gathering what variables I can and want to access on these objects, is through looking at the object and then hooking them up in code. Okay, last one. Now that we've broken a half hour, I'm going to get to the meat of this thing. I have made submenus as a class, and what that means is, and I have them hooked up to my dropdown. You'll see no submenu, submenu 1, submenu 2. If I click submenu 1, it actually creates a whole pane with buttons in it and text and things like that. If I hit submenu 2, I have a slider that I can use, I have a toggle, and I have an image with a different text. And then if I go back to no submenu, it hides all of it. You'll see over on the right, when I go to submenu 1, all I'm doing is enabling submenu 1. That's all I'm doing. And then if I come back here to no submenu, that guy's gone. Man, just all the noise today. I just can't catch a break with this. Anyway, yeah, so the way that I'm doing this is pretty straightforward. On my UI master, I have that list right here of submenus. A submenu object contains a string for the value that I want to use to show this object. So what that means is when I call show submenu, I have to pass it a string, which is right here, show submenu string. It then loops through all of our different submenus and tries to find a submenu with the value that matches show value that I passed to it. And then when it finds that, it says, hey, show that submenu, right? It's pretty straightforward, and all that does is it sets active on everything in the toShow array. So, as an example, submenu 1 has the show value of submenu 1. And on my drop-down menu, I have a value of submenu 1. Submenu 1 will then attach to... Sorry, the input, or the drop-down menu is attached to the UI master with this drop-down. And when the value changes, because again, it's on value changed, so as soon as I select one of these submenus, it then says, hey, UI master, here I am. Where is it? What is it called? Set drop-down value. Set drop-down value right here. It says, hey, here I am. Here's the new drop-down value. We're going to set that drop-down value to whatever the text, again, whatever, well, so here's, yeah, okay, sorry. I just remembered how complicated drop-down values are. So the drop-down menus work like this. They have options, right? And this is, if you look over here, these are called options. So these are the different values that you want to access, right? So we have options, and options is an array. Well, it's not really an array, it's a list. So if you wanted to access the length of it, you wouldn't do length. It doesn't have a length. It has a count. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do with lists that you can't do with arrays, and vice versa. But I haven't really talked about lists very much. Think of them kind of sort of like arrays in reading information from them. So you can actually do open close brackets, and then you can, which one of these options do you want to get? Well, value over here is actually an integer value for which one of those three objects is currently selected. So you can say new val.value, and that'll be the current slot in the options list that we are selected, that we have selected. And then .text is the actual text value that we have input into the options. Again, you don't necessarily have to drive it through text. I chose to because I don't know why. I probably shouldn't have. I probably should have made this an integer value instead for show value, and then I could have actually, come to think of it, I probably just could have eliminated that entirely. Actually, let's do that. I'm going to fix my thing here. So submenus are going to be this, and instead of, oh, I know why I did it that way. So what I was going to do is I was going to eliminate that variable, and I was just going to use my actual drop-down list as which slot things were in, and then I was going to just do, where is it? I was going to do that. And then from here, I was going to say, this is an int, this is a submenu slot, and then I was going to say current menu, hide it, and then we wouldn't have to do this loop anymore. We could just say this equals submenu slot, and then yeah, we would effectively do this. I don't want to do this because then I have to make sure that every single one of these submenus actually has a thing associated with it. So we could actually say, well, oh yeah, see, it's already throwing errors too. Blah, blah. Why is it a string? It shouldn't be a string. Show submenu is an int. Is value a string? No, it's an int. Ah, okay. It's just, for some reason, I didn't save. Okay, so now, instead of these, we have a to show, well, okay. We have our three different submenus here. And the first one shows nothing. The first one shows submenu 1, and the second one shows submenu 2. So in theory, this should still work. Yeah, it still works. Okay. So that's probably a better way to go about it. It's just kind of sloppy. The idea is that you have to have a blank menu somewhere if you want the ability to be able to turn everything off. So my submenu 0 is just empty. It doesn't have anything to show in it, but everything else does. And these numbers, the slot in the array, element 0, 1, 2, are the drop-down values here. So right now, I'll show you what I mean by that. So right now the submenu has a value of 0, which means that we're going to be showing submenu 0, which is nothing. And if I set this to 1, the drop-down menu now has a value of 1, therefore we are showing element 1 of our submenus. So that's kind of how that is working now. And that's probably how it should work, but I don't like the fact that I have to have an empty submenu to govern that, and I have less control. Like, it's not as contextual as I would like. A number in this case is kind of strange. I would rather that the submenu has a name and I call it by name. That way, I can effectively have the same drop-down menu have two options in it that call the same menu, and I can't really do that right now. But anyway, so submenus are pretty straightforward as far as like setting them up this way. But that's a way for you to have like a UI object, this drop-down, loop into my UI master, which then sets sets active and deactive on things that are inactive. That's active or inactive on objects within the UI. So you can have the UI control other aspects of the UI effectively. You just have to have like a script kind of like as a medium between the two. Most of the time, it's better to do it that way. You don't have to, but you'll get more expected results if you actually script something to make things happen the way that you want them to. And in this case, I'm just hooking it up to the submenu 1 and 2 base objects, which have everything parented to them, which, by the way, the submenu 1 object is just a pane. Remember, I went over panes and how they're good for organization? This is exactly what I meant by that. It's kind of like a way for your a window to appear based off of something that you have selected. So if I say, hey, I want submenu 1 to appear, that's saying, hey, open up window 1. So yeah, hopefully that makes some sort of sense. But yeah, if I disable this object, then it disables all the stuff underneath it, which you'll also notice it will automatically set up all of the navigation for your buttons as well. Remember how we have navigation automatic set for these things? It'll actually at runtime dynamically rebuild your navigation if more UI objects become active or inactive, right? So if I turn this guy off, this button is now no longer active, so it won't be part of the navigation anymore. So another interesting point. But yeah, as always, let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about anything, if I wasn't clear about something, or if you have any feedback on these videos, that would be cool. If you want to learn anything specifically, I am building towards something still. I think I might have like one more video of UI stuff, maybe, and then after that I will go into to static classes and how to manipulate data that persists between scenes and how to build those systems so that you can access them much easier than we have been. That being said, well, the way that we have been accessing it is through prefabs and things like that, which I wouldn't like to do. We haven't been doing a lot of it, so it makes sense if you're like, what the hell is he talking about? We've been using prefabs as a base for storing information in certain videos and certain places. I want to get away from that, and I want to start using static classes for things like that. That way we can build systems that are better and more flexible. And then that will lead into the big topic this is kind of going towards. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions, if you have any complaints, comments, in the comments below. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I will help where I can. And I hope this was helpful on that note. Well, cool. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.